We often first encounter Anne Boleyn at the height of drama, standing at the centre of a court scandal, entangled with the married King Henry VIII, her future already hurtling towards tragedy. But Anne Boleyn didn't emerge from nowhere. She wasn't a common girl who rose above her station. She wasn't a merchant's daughter who just got lucky. Anne Boleyn was born into privilege, lineage, and political expectation. She came from three powerful dynasties: the Boleyns, wealthy, ambitious, increasingly influential; the Butlers, one of the greatest Anglo-Irish noble houses; and the Howards, premier English aristocracy with royal blood. For generations, these families had been building land and estates, continental and courtly connections, noble alliances, and claims to inheritance and status. By the time Anne was born, her world was already shaped by status, diplomacy, and elite identity, not obscurity. I'm historian and author Claire Ridgway, and this episode, The Making of Anne Boleyn, is the start of a special documentary-type series on Anne. Please do make sure you're subscribed and you've hit the notification bell so you don't miss my following episodes. As historian Gareth Russell and I have both argued, Anne's contemporaries did not see her as socially inferior. If anything, she was considered a fitting match for a nobleman, perhaps even an earl. She was the granddaughter of one of the greatest heiresses in Northern Europe, descended from royal bloodlines on both sides of her family. And as Lauren Mackay has highlighted in her work on Thomas Boleyn, this was not the accidental outcome of a single generation's ambition. It was the product of a long, deliberate process of dynastic positioning. To understand Anne Boleyn, her confidence, her identity, her sense of belonging in elite circles, and the expectations placed upon her life, we need to begin not with Henry VIII, but with the families who made her. The Boleyns are often dismissed as mere merchants or social climbers, a family who appeared suddenly in the Tudor world through luck, ambition, or opportunism. But the reality is far richer and far older. The rise of the Boleyns was slow, deliberate, and multi-generational, stretching back long before Anne's great-grandfather Geoffrey entered London's mercantile elite. The origins of the family are not known with absolute certainty, but there is a long-standing tradition reflected in antiquarian research and genealogical scholarship that the Boleyns may have descended from the Norman Counts of Boulogne, whose followers accompanied William the Conqueror to England in the 11th century, settling in areas such as Somerset, Surrey, and later Norfolk. Whether or not every strand of that medieval connection can be definitely proven, what matters is that by the 12th and 13th centuries, there were clearly Boleyns or Boleyn or de Boleyns established in Norfolk. Lauren Mackay notes evidence of Boleyns in the Wood Rising area by this period, and by the mid-13th century we find Simon de Boleyn recorded as holding lands in the parish of Saul, just a few miles from Blickling, the estate later associated with Anne's birth. Saul was not a noble stronghold, but a rural parish community structured around landholding, the wool trade, craft production, and church life. Yet for the Boleyns it became an anchor of identity. The church of St. Peter and St. Paul at Saul still houses the tombs of Anne's great-great-grandparents, Geoffrey Boleyn and his wife Alice. The Reverend Canon W.L.E. Parsons, rector of Saul in the 1930s, traced a sequence of Boleyns in local records. A John Boleyn in the 13th century, followed in the 14th by further Johns and Nicholases, and a Thomas Boleyn who inherited family lands. From Thomas came a Geoffrey, a tenant farmer involved in the wool trade and even in the building of the parish church. He appears at times as energetic, occasionally quarrelsome, and not entirely unfamiliar with minor offences. A man firmly embedded in his local world. But it was his son, also named Geoffrey, who would transform the destiny of the family. As a young man, Geoffrey Jr. left Norfolk and came under the patronage of Sir John Fastolf, a wealthy landowner and veteran of the 100 Years' War. Through Fastolf's connections, he made his way to London, entered the powerful Mercers' Company, and began to rise through the city's civic and political hierarchy. Geoffrey became Sheriff of London and Middlesex, an alderman, a Member of Parliament, and finally, in 1457, Lord Mayor of London. He was knighted and was wealthy enough to lend substantial sums directly to the Crown, including funding for military campaigns in France. Yet Geoffrey did not reinvest that fortune back into trade. Instead, he converted commercial wealth into land, the true currency of status. He purchased estates across Norfolk, Middlesex, Surrey, Sussex and Kent, acquiring Blickling Manor from Fastolf and, most significantly, the manor and castle of Hever. He began improving and renovating the estate, laying the foundations for what would become the Boleyn family seat. By the time of his death in 1463, Geoffrey Boleyn had become not only a leading civic figure, but a landed gentleman, leaving behind estates, resources, and carefully arranged marriage prospects for his children. This was the deliberate construction of a dynasty. Geoffrey's eldest son, Sir William Boleyn, inherited that new world. Now, William didn't follow in his father's footsteps in commerce. Instead, he built a career in royal and county service. He became a Knight of the Body, served as a Commissioner of the Peace, acted as Sheriff of Norfolk and Suffolk, and took part in royal military campaigns. And then came the decisive step, the marriage that elevated the Boleyns from prosperous gentry into dynastic significance. William married Lady Margaret Butler, daughter and co-heiress of Thomas Butler, 7th Earl of Ormond. And they were the parents of Thomas Boleyn, Anne Boleyn's father. Now, Lady Margaret Butler, Anne's paternal grandmother, was no ordinary heiress. She belonged to the Butlers of Ormond, a dynasty that had been central to English authority in Ireland for centuries. Their roots stretched deep into the medieval world. The family traced its descent from Theobald Walter, 1st Baron Butler, a nobleman of the 12th century whose family connections and early royal service placed the Butlers firmly within the fabric of Anglo-Irish aristocracy. Theobald and his brother Hubert were raised in the household of Ranulph de Glanville, Justiciar of England in the 1180s, where they also encountered Prince John, the future King John. When John travelled to Ireland in 1185 as Lord of Ireland, Theobald accompanied him, and it was in this period that the foundations of the Butler dynasty were laid. The family name itself emerged from high ceremonial office. In 1177, Theobald was appointed Chief Butler of Ireland, the Botelier, or butler, the royal cupbearer. And from this role came both the family title and its surname, Le Botella, or butler. As chief butler, Theobald and his heirs were to attend English coronations, presenting the first cup of wine to the monarch in exchange for a royal plate, a ceremonial duty that embedded the family into the ritual and symbolism of kingship. Through his service, lands were granted to Theobald in East Munster, Ormond, laying the territorial and political foundations of the earldom that would define the dynasty for centuries to come. The Butlers established religious houses, administered estate centres, and became key stabilising figures within Ireland's English-governed territories. By the time of Anne's grandmother, Margaret Butler, the Ormond line possessed extensive estates in both Ireland and England, political authority, deep-rooted royal connections, and a long tradition of loyal service to the crown. The family seat in Ireland, Kilkenny Castle, had begun life as a 13th century fortress built for William Marshall, 4th Earl of Pembroke, before being acquired in 1391 by James Butler, 3rd Earl of Ormond. From that point onward, Kilkenny became the heart of Butler identity, a centre of administration, culture, patronage and aristocratic life, and it remained the family residence into the 20th century. Anne Boleyn did not simply descend from this lineage in an abstract genealogical sense. She grew up within the shadow and memory of it, and quite possibly in the presence of Margaret Butler herself, a formidable noble matriarch whose wealth, stature and authority must have made an enormous impression on the young Anne. Research into the Butler lineage has shown that through Margaret, Anne was descended from Edward I and Eleanor of Castile, Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II. Margaret's father, Anne's grandfather, Thomas Butler, 7th Earl of Ormond, was one of the wealthiest magnates of his generation. He held vast estates on both sides of the Irish Sea and served at the very heart of the royal household, acting as Chamberlain to Queen Elizabeth of York, Queen Consort of King Henry VII, and serving in the same office under Catherine of Aragon for 3 years before retiring due to age in 1512. This was a family intimately connected not only to land and power, but to queens, ceremony and court authority. On her mother's side, Anne Boleyn belonged to the Howard family, one of the most powerful, prestigious and deeply entrenched noble dynasties in Tudor England. The Howards were not newcomers to influence or favour. They were ancient aristocracy, shaped by centuries of service, ambition, loyalty and survival. The family could trace its ancestry back to Thomas of Brotherton, son of Edward I, and through various lines to Edmund Crouchback. They also claimed descent from Hereward the Wake, the 11th century figure who resisted Norman rule, a lineage that combined royal blood with a proud tradition of defiance. These weren't merely impressive names, they were statements of identity, status and long memory. Anne's maternal great-grandfather, John Howard, embodied that tradition. A committed Yorkist, he served Edward IV loyally and rose steadily through royal service. Under Richard III, he was rewarded with the title of Duke of Norfolk in 1483 and held the great offices of Earl Marshal and Lord Admiral. At Richard's coronation, he carried the crown itself, a potent symbol of proximity to power. 2 years later, he died fighting for that same king at the Battle of Bosworth. Bosworth was catastrophic for the Howards. John's son Thomas Howard, Anne Boleyn's grandfather, fought alongside his father for Richard III and paid the price. He was captured, imprisoned in the Tower of London, attainted and stripped of his titles and lands when Henry VII came to the throne. Overnight, one of England's premier families fell from the summit of aristocratic life into disgrace and uncertainty. And yet, the Howards endured. Contemporaries noted that even in their reduced circumstances, the family carried themselves with unmistakable aristocratic confidence. They didn't vanish from sight. They waited, calculated, and demonstrated cautious loyalty to the new Tudor regime. Thomas Howard's refusal to escape from the Tower during the Earl of Lincoln's rebellion in 1487 was a crucial turning point. It proved his loyalty to the new regime. Slowly, painstakingly, the family clawed its way back into favour. By 1489, Thomas Howard had been restored as Earl of Surrey. He went on to serve Henry VII loyally as a Northern lieutenant, diplomat and treasurer. His full rehabilitation came under King Henry VIII, and most spectacularly in 1513 when Thomas commanded English forces against the Scots at the Battle of Flodden. The victory crushed Scottish resistance and restored the Howard name to glory. Thomas was once again created Duke of Norfolk, a public declaration that the family had reclaimed its place at the top of the aristocracy. Anne Boleyn's mother, Elizabeth Howard, grew up in the shadow of this path to restoration. She was the daughter of Thomas Howard and his first wife, Elizabeth Tilney, herself descended from the ancient Tilney and Cheney families. Through her mother, Elizabeth Howard was connected to an extensive network of noble kin, including, through later marriages, Jane Seymour. These were families with pre-conquest roots and generations of service to the crown. Elizabeth Tilney had first been married to Sir Humphrey Boucher, killed fighting for the Yorkists at Barnet in 1471, which meant that her daughter Elizabeth also had ties to the Boucher family, another strand of aristocratic power. Contemporary descriptions present Elizabeth Howard as beautiful, dignified and refined, praised by the poet John Skelton for her noble bearing and her womanly features. Her marriage to Thomas Boleyn was far more than a comfortable match. It was almost certainly strategic. Thomas Boleyn was ambitious, capable and rising fast at court, and the union brought together the ancient prestige of the Howards with the upward momentum of the Boleyns. It was a blending of this ancient nobility and modern courtly success. By the end of the 15th century, the Boleyn family held estates across several counties, moved within noble and diplomatic circles, and were already close to the world of royal progresses and court culture. This was a family who belonged within the structures of power, and by Anne's generation they were recognised as entirely suitable for elite alliances, long before either Mary or Anne ever crossed paths with Henry VIII. With these three dynastic threads woven together, the Butlers, Boleyns and Howards, we can begin to see the world into which Anne Boleyn was born, a world shaped by estates, memory, expectation, and the quiet machinery of court service and diplomacy. Her upbringing didn't take place on the margins of society, but within households where connections, learning, piety, and preparation for elite life were part of the rhythm of daily existence. To understand the young Anne, her confidence, her curiosity in developing sense of identity, we now need to step inside those early environments, the family home, relationships and educational influences that nurtured her from childhood and helped form the woman she would become. Although Anne's later reputation and ultimately her fate would overshadow the quieter years of her childhood, those years were critical in forming the girl who would one day navigate the courts of Europe with confidence, intelligence and self-possession. Most historians agree that Anne's sister Mary was born first, probably around 1499 or 1500, with Anne following sometime between 1501 and 1507. The exact year remains one of the most contested aspects of Anne's biography. Some scholars argue for a birth around 1501, pointing to her early placement in continental courts and the maturity of her education by the early 1510s. And others favour a later date, around 1507, noting that she was still unmarried when Henry VIII's interest in her deepened in the mid-1520s. The evidence is tantalising but inconclusive. Thomas Boleyn himself, writing later in life, recalled the financial strain of his early marriage to Elizabeth Howard, explaining that in those first years she brought him every year a child, suggesting a rapid sequence of births in the opening decade of the 16th century. And when Anne wrote from the court of Margaret of Austria in 1513, her handwriting and grasp of French suggests a girl whose education was already well developed, behaviour and ability perhaps more consistent with a well-trained pre-teen than a very young child. The debate belongs to the realm of historical interpretation and will be explored more fully in one of my companion episodes to this documentary. But for our purposes today, what matters is this. Wherever we place Anne's birth within that range, She was born into privilege. She wasn't a child whose position in life was uncertain. Her future was already being shaped by family ambition, courtly networks, and the expectations of a girl intended for elite service. Anne's early years were likely spent in Norfolk. At Blickling Hall, the Boleyn seat acquired and expanded by her great-grandfather, Sir Geoffrey Boleyn, and later inherited by her father, Thomas. Blickling stood not merely as a residence, but as a visible symbol of the Boleyns' transformation from prosperous gentry into a family moving confidently within noble and royal circles. By the very late 1490s, Thomas Boleyn and Elizabeth Howard were living there as a young aristocratic couple, newly married, ambitious and steadily advancing at court. We know that Blickling was already part of the Boleyns' active social and political world because in 1498, Henry VII himself visited Mr. Boleyn while on progress, an honour that underscored the family's rising status and proximity to royal power. And Mr. Boleyn must have been Thomas Boleyn because his father was Sir William Boleyn. It was in this environment, surrounded by household attendants, retainers, visiting courtiers, and the rhythms of domestic life, that Mary, and in all probability Anne, spent their earliest years. Here their world would have been one of ordered domestic routine, religious observance, early discipline and deportment, and carefully structured social training. From infancy, children in elite households were immersed in symbolism, ritual and expectation. A newborn girl's entry into the world was marked by ritual care. Her umbilical cord examined for signs of future fertility, her body bathed and wrapped, and her head covered by a tiny linen cap. Within days, sometimes within hours, baptism followed, a deeply spiritual and socially significant event. The priest exorcised evil spirits, anointed the child with oil, and dipped her in the font before passing her to her godmother, a symbolic moment of spiritual transfer and communal belonging. She was now part of the church family. And Anne's baptism likely took place at St Andrew's, Blickling, a church where today Boleyn family memorial brasses can still be seen. In 1505, following the death of his father, Sir William Boleyn, Thomas Boleyn inherited not only the Blickling estate, but also Hever Castle in Kent, the property his grandfather Geoffrey had acquired and begun to transform into a comfortable, strategically positioned family residence. From this point on, the evidence suggests that Thomas increasingly based himself in Kent, acting as a conscientious local landowner and steward, while simultaneously advancing his career in royal service. Hever was ideally situated, close enough to London to remain connected to court events and administrative duties, yet far enough away to serve as a refuge from political intensity. It became the beating heart of the Boleyn domestic world. By the second decade of the 16th century, Hever had become the centre of family life, the place where Thomas and Elizabeth raised their children, oversaw their estates, and entertained visiting relatives, friends, and political associates. This shift from Norfolk to Kent did not represent a decline in status. It represented consolidation. Thomas Boleyn's career was accelerating. His diplomatic and court appointments placed him firmly within the inner workings of Tudor political life. At the same time, Hever provided a stable domestic base, grounding his family within a cultivated, well-structured and socially sophisticated environment. For Anne, Mary and their brothers, childhood meant large, carefully managed households, seasonal rhythms of estate life, exposure to visiting nobles and courtiers, and immersion in a world of cultural refinement. Hever was not, as popular culture has sometimes implied, a quiet provincial retreat. It was a place of movement, connections, and preparation. Anne grew up as part of a tightly knit sibling group. Her brothers Henry and Thomas died young, But her relationship with her surviving siblings, Mary and George, appears to have been particularly formative. The three likely shared household tutors, social training, religious instruction, and crucially, intellectual education. Boys and girls in top-level households were often educated together in their early years, especially in languages, music, and the foundations of literacy. The expectation was not that girls simply acquired decorative skills, but that they become socially fluent, culturally competent, and capable of navigating elite environments. In the Boleyn household, this educational environment was intensified by Thomas Boleyn's own outlook. Thomas was not only an ambitious courtier and diplomat, he was a Renaissance humanist in inclination, a man who valued language, learning, and cultivated expression. Like other humanist fathers, such as Sir Thomas More or Sir Anthony Cook, Thomas believed that education was as important for daughters as it was for sons. Anne and Mary's education was therefore not accidental, it was intentional, it was designed. A Tudor girl's education began with behaviour long before it expanded into scholarship. From infancy, she learnt to kneel in prayer, to control her posture and expression, to sit silently when required, and to show proper manners at the table. The day began early, rising before dawn, kneeling at bedside to recite prayers, washing and dressing under the supervision of a nurse or gentlewoman, and presenting herself to her elders with composure and courtesy. From as soon as she could speak, she memorised the Lord's Prayer, the Ave Maria, the Apostles' Creed, and the Ten Commandments. These were not merely acts of devotion, they were exercises in discipline, attention, and moral identity. At the age of 7, a key shift occurred. A child was no longer seen as spiritually innocent. She was now considered morally responsible. Her training intensified. Lessons became more formal, expectations increased. For Anne and Mary, this meant instruction that went far beyond domestic skills. As well as household management, they learnt reading and writing, languages, music and dancing, needlework and embroidery, and conversation and deportment. These weren't idle accomplishments, they were tools of social navigation. They marked Anne not for a quiet domestic future, but for life in international courts. Thomas Boleyn's influence can be strongly felt in this period of his daughters' lives. He was a linguist, diplomat, and cultivated courtier, a man comfortable among ambassadors, scholars, and statesmen. His own success depended on fluency, learning, and cultural adaptability. It is unsurprising, then, that he invested in similar qualities for his children. Anne's education bore the marks of humanist thinking, languages encouraged, intellectual curiosity nurtured, and polished self-presentation expected. Alongside this, however, discipline remained central. Tudor educational writers frequently stressed the need to avoid indulgence in children, and even when more compassionate approaches began to be advocated by figures like Roger Ascham and Thomas Eliot, comparing child rearing to the careful nurturing of a delicate plant, the underlying values remained consistent: obedience, self-control, respect for authority, and moral restraint. We can glimpse the success of this upbringing through later evidence. For example, in Mary Boleyn's eloquent and measured letter to Thomas Cromwell defending her second marriage. Her language, tone, and rhetorical skill are evidence of a girl who'd been thoroughly schooled in not only literacy, but considered argument and emotional moderation. Anne would absorb the same qualities. Her later confidence at court, her ability to converse effortlessly in French, to engage in theological debate, to carry herself with poise and assurance, that wasn't the consequence of sudden transformation. It was the fruit of years of careful preparation. By 1513, Anne's childhood education had progressed as far as it could within the domestic world of Hever. She'd learnt the languages, skills and social disciplines expected of a girl destined for high service. Her next stage would not be simply another level of schooling. It would be immersion in the living, breathing political and cultural world of Europe. At the court of Margaret of Austria, one of the most intellectually vibrant courts of the early 16th century, Anne would continue not only her education, but her formation. And that, her first step beyond England, is where the next stage of our story will begin.